Good morning or good afternoon, depending on when you're listening to us. This is the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I'm being joined by regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, one of three reps from the town of Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Hello, Olga. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And welcome Brenda Siegel, who is a candidate for Vermont Governor in this November election. And November seems to be coming fast, Brenda. How are you doing?
I am doing well. It's definitely moving quickly, but I'm having a great time. So
I want to just dive right in with a question that I'm asking all the candidates who have been coming on the show so far. And that's, of all the ways that a person can serve their community through volunteering or working for a service organization or something, why did you choose the path of elected office?
I do a lot of advocacy work, and I also do a lot of that volunteering in the community and other ways. And I am watching people really struggle and suffer, especially around the issues that I work on most, around housing and around the overdose crisis. And I see so many places where we have strong systemic barriers, and there are fixes to those barriers, even within just rules and within the inefficiency within the administration, which is why I chose to run and why I chose to run for governor.
Thank you. We're going to talk about housing today, actually, which is something we've talked about on the show a lot, because in Vermont, it's a thing. And I'm curious, from your perspective, Brenda, given how much the Vermont community and the state of Vermont has been focused on housing, what issues or what pieces of the conversation do you feel have been left out, or where are the gaps in the conversation, maybe is the way to put it?
So the thing that has been really a struggle is that there needs to be both a short-term plan on emergency, transitional, and permanent housing, and a long-term strategic plan on emergency, transitional, and permanent housing. And because we don't have this overall plan on housing, we're just kind of piecemeal throwing it together. And right now in the governor's office, there is a governor who doesn't want to put together that overall plan. He does want to put money in permanent housing, but the problem is that we keep ending up in a crisis place around the transitional and emergency housing, which really puts a stop in the forward movement on the long-term plan. And so that's really where, and I also see, I want to just add, I see our legislators working extremely hard on finding solutions, especially for low and moderate income families, and then having those solutions thwarted by vetoes or by threats of veto. And that's the work that I think we can change if we have someone collaborative in the governor's office.
Emily, I'm curious, what Brenda said about piecemeal kind of efforts or work, really I find intriguing. Does that echo what you've been seeing from your perspective?
Yeah, we put a lot of money into the construction of long-term housing or the rehab of long-term housing. But as we've talked about before on the show, or really anyone who's ever built anything, including just like a table, knows it takes a long time. And so while we are bringing more units online, it's going to be quite a while until we really see the full success of all of that money we invested. We passed a bond before I was elected. So that was 5 years ago. I think we passed a massive housing bond. It was the biggest one we'd ever passed. We're just seeing those units come online now and just having sort of the ribbon cuttings and the success of those. And those were tiny investments compared to what we were able to do with ARPA funds. And so we have that long-term housing that's in development. It's exciting. It's still not as strategic as it could be. We're still not having the kinds of meaningful conversations we maybe could have about the policy changes we might need to make in order to develop long-term housing that meets everyone's needs. And we've talked to Chris Campany about that, and we've talked to Maura Collins about that before on the show. But we are not focusing as much as we could on affordable housing that sort of meets the different demographic needs that we have available. We're not talking about affordable housing, lowercase a and uppercase a, if listeners can follow that weird way of describing it. Sort of like legally, technically affordable housing, and that's just housing people can afford. And so we're not, because we're in a crisis mode, we're not thinking as strategically and creatively as we could about the mix that we're aiming towards a decade down the line and what policy changes we need to make for that mix decade down the line. The work that we have done to do that decade down the line strategic thinking was a few bills that the governor vetoed last year. Was the rental registry bill, the Act 250 reforms bill, a few other pieces. And then the short-term housing, as we again talked about in the show, and Brenda has talked a lot about publicly, the miracle of the COVID response here in Vermont was we said, oh my goodness, everyone deserves a place to live in the middle of a crisis. And we put everyone into emergency housing. And it was amazing, the health outcomes that we saw in Windham County from everyone having housing, even if it was like medium term or short term, it was still like you knew where you were going the next night. And throughout that entire process, all of the housing partners have been saying like, okay, what happens after this? We've been saying what's going to happen after that. Brenda's been saying what's going to happen after that. And the administration has twice come out very publicly, despite legislative action in another direction, and said, okay, next week it's all going to end. Or okay, next month it's all going to end. And we know that that just happened a few weeks ago. We talked about it last week with John Walters. And then at Joint Fiscal Committee, we dove into it a little bit deeper yesterday. But through that process, I've talked a lot with Josh Davis down here. There's been a lot of work down here in Windham County to say like, okay, what's a medium-term solution? Like, can we buy a motel to use as a medium-term solution? Like, can we expand and stabilize our short-term emergency housing responses so that they're livable instead of, congregate housing on the floor, which is what we've used, so just so Vermonters don't freeze to death. And I can talk more about sort of the compromises that the administration came to yet 2 days ago, but that's sort of where we are.
Yeah, I would add that that's been a huge frustration. So I'm on the GA working group, so I know that they did not work with partners before ahead of this announcement. They should have known, in my opinion, if they were doing proper planning and proper budgeting when the legislature was still in session, and the legislature could have helped to make sure that people were able to remain housed through the winter. And when they did know, because they weren't doing that proper planning and proper budgeting in July, they did not come to the GA working group that they have right there with providers, with partners, to figure out how do we move forward. And all of us really were working together. Even though I was in this election, I was continuing to work alongside in that group on that work. And I got to when we got to the 31st and that announcement was made, I really think it was around controlling the narrative, because they knew it was going to be a disaster. And my concern is that just like someone in poverty who's in that situation, you're asking them to take their nothing and make a plan for how they're going to survive through the winter. Well, we should have been taking how little we had left, considering the poor planning, and figuring out how we're going to make sure that the people in the state are able to not only survive, but also be able to continue these health outcomes, continue where they had found stability through the winter. And the administration did not give legislators in the session or the GA working group partners an opportunity to weigh in on how we do that work. And we might have been in a different place right now if that had happened.
Thank you, Brenda. Sorry, just quickly, Emily, remind listeners what the GA working group is.
I thought my question was.
It's the General Assistance Working Group, but around general assistance housing specifically, and emergency housing, really. But we dive deeply into transitional housing as part of that as well.
And so Josh Davis from Groundwork sat on it for a really long time. He's not doing that right now, but what is, I think, really important to remember. When the original the GA rules were being rewritten to be more humane before the pandemic, there was like a very active process to rewrite those rules during the pandemic, because what the base rules are is that if you become homeless, you get a motel room if it's below freezing out and the weather is very bad, or if you meet this like point system of vulnerability. And we talked about that on the show a long time ago, but it's kind of a wild vulnerability point system. Like, you get like 2 points, and this is just an example, it's not the actual points. You get like 2 points for being disabled and 3 points for having a kid, but more points for a kid below the age of 5 and less points for a kid above the age of 5. And like, it's just the whole thing's a little wild.
And it's not below freezing, it's below 20 degrees.
Thank you. So like freezing to death, not just cold, right?
Yeah.
So there's that. And what I experienced when I was working in economic services and sort of like the front line of people coming in to apply for GA housing, back when that was the system for applying for GA housing, people would just like spend their entire day checking the weather report to see if they were going to have somewhere to sleep that night. And it's not the weather in Brattleboro, it's the weather in Waterbury where they were making the decision. So, and
that's an interesting wrinkle.
So,
and it's not the weather, it's whether or not the DCF calls it.
Yeah.
And so that means that if they haven't called it on a Friday for a Saturday, but the weather changes on Saturday, then that decision doesn't change. So if it suddenly was supposed to be 32 degrees and now it's 15, that doesn't matter.
And so all of that like wild, difficult irrationality, and in addition to like, it's irrational from the outside from a policy perspective, it's also just like, that's a lot to live with, to know whether or not you're gonna have somewhere to sleep. And so they were rewriting the rules before the pandemic. And one thing that was very clear in that rewriting of the rules was that and why the GA working group was so important is that different community partners had very different resources available for their communities and were very available for different solutions. And that's been true through the pandemic, where there have been conversations statewide. One of the reasons that the administration used for trying to shut down this program in the spring, was that last spring, this spring?
Yeah, they tried to shut it down in September, last July, September, and then October.
Right.
October was when we stayed on the State House steps.
And so when the first time that happened, there was a lot of talk about how the motels didn't want to cooperate in this program anymore, and there weren't enough motel rooms. And that might have been true in Rutland County. It wasn't true in Windham County. We had great community partnerships in Windham County to keep people staying in the motels. And so the GA working group is really important, even if it turns out that we don't have the money available for this and we can't find the money, to make sure that whatever solutions we're finding are solutions that meet the needs of the specific communities and the community partners and the resources available. Mary Hooper at the Joint Fiscal Committee, who's the chair of appropriations, was saying that her community, the greater Montpelier, Waterbury, et cetera area, they don't even have like a drop-in overnight shelter for, which, we used to have in the church basement here in Brattleboro, but now Groundworks actually has like a fully sort of functional system at their actual shelter for that. And so those kinds of differences from community to community point to a really different transition plan that's needed. And the administration sort of announced this with no transition plan. So all that to say, like, good planning makes for good health outcomes. And we have been in that place of good planning.
So Brenda, talk to us a little bit about what planning you would like to see or what planning you would hope to implement.
Sure. In this emergency step, what I would have liked to see and what I would still like to see is that there's a lot of solutions happening that we could work on. There is pods going up in Burlington that could have been built across the state and that probably still could if we did a little bit of work. There are pallet housing. I don't know if anyone's heard of that, but the pallet housing goes up and comes back down. So also is good in natural disaster. And then there is also our empty dormitories that could be utilized.
So many empty dormitories.
Yes. And so these are things that we could be using right now, and we could be taking some funding and making sure that we're going to get people through this time that this mistake is. I really think it's our responsibility, to the state's responsibility, to address a crisis that happened because of this improper planning. I don't think that's fair to put it on the most marginalized people in the state. I think that's really problematic. And then longer term, as governor, I would like to see us put together this short-term emergency plan before this housing that Emily talks about gets online, that works on both these kind of short-term solutions, these emergency solutions, and some transitional housing that makes sure people get to stay for longer periods of time, and can start to get their feet back under them with different service providers, with when I slept on the State House steps for 27 nights last year, I was there with somebody who had been chronically homeless for 6 years. And he talks openly about how that helped him being in the stability of the GA program. And now he is finally in a single room occupancy. That helped him, access eye care and get glasses for the first time and be able to access therapy. For all the trauma that he experienced. I mean, he saw a friend freeze to death. There's real trauma out there for him. And so I want to see us make sure that we build those wraparound services into the transitional short-term plan. And then long-term, our plan needs to make it so that most people, when they enter homelessness, it's a very temporary thing, and that we have a way to transition them into permanent housing, including people that are difficult to house, which is, often people with severe mental illness, folks who have no rental history, and so it's really hard to get them into housing, people with substance use disorder with no barrier or low barrier housing. Make sure that that is included, but we also have to look at how rents are skyrocketing across the state. That means that even people in middle income settings can't find housing right now, can't be in the rental market. I met a mom with 2 kids who's middle income, was no cause evicted from her home in Burlington, and can't get back in the housing market, has been living in the car with her kids for a long time. And so that we're not just talking about people traditionally experiencing chronic homelessness. We're talking about a really broad spectrum right now. And so those permanent housing solutions need to be something that we look at as, what is our actual need right now? What is our projected need for the future? Is the money that we've put into housing going to actually meet that projected need at the time that it comes online? And if not, what is our solution to make sure we get to that need? And then there has to be some studies done to put triggers in place for if we find ourselves barreling down this same crisis again in the future, so that we don't get to where we are right now, because where we are right now is not caused by the pandemic primarily. It has been a long coming problem.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Brenda. Emily.
Yeah.
One thing, or I'll put this to both of you, one thing I always find interesting about a lot of our safety net programs, for lack of a better term, they always feel to me like they kick in too late. Like they really want someone, but someone really has to be at a very acute point of crisis. And then they end too early. Like you get someone just a little bit stabilized, and then the program might either taper off or disappear. I would love to hear from either of you. A, am I seeing that correctly? And B, like, what kind of policy levers do we need to pull to kind of sort that out?
Yeah, so I'm talking to people just similar to the family that Brenda described, who have been in some cases have been in the same stable rental housing for 20 years, were evicted because their building was being sold, had a lot of notice, had good relationships with their landlords, who are still the person who owns the building that they live in, were asked to leave, had a huge runway, wound up being legally evicted because they had nowhere to go despite their intention to find another place, and are now homeless. So that's sort of one category of folks that small policy levers, small changes would make a big difference for. And then there's, even actually the administration on Wednesday at Joint Fiscal Committee said, we know that keeping someone in rental housing, subsidizing rent as rents skyrocket and people can't afford the rent is so much less expensive than paying for a motel nightly, which is the state pays, right now is paying more than $180 a night for some folks. And let me tell you, these are not motels that look like they're $180 a night by any means. And actually some price gouging is like, there could be some investigation of that right now. But so we know it's less expensive to keep people in their housing. We know a lot of folks are entering this crisis who don't actually have any experience with it. They don't know what the housing market looks like right now. They don't know what their options are available. Most housing support services don't kick in until you're legally homeless. And legally homeless isn't even like you don't have somewhere to stay this night. Like there's a whole universe where couch surfing doesn't technically count as homeless in some situations. And so absolutely, yes, that's true. And then on the opposite side, when someone gets even in temporary housing, sometimes the housing support services pull back. Not because actually the house, like technically someone's not eligible anymore. Most medium-term housing at this point includes housing support services technically, but our housing support providers are so strapped and still quite underfunded. And so they're going where the crisis is because there's constant crisis because people are street homeless. So they're heading to the constant crisis rather than being able to put their energy into sort of the proactive planning with folks. And so if more folks were in medium term or even short-term stable housing, housing providers would have more time and space and training even to be able to engage in that longer term planning with folks. So yes, it like both ends of the spectrum are not available in our system right now.
And I would say that there's lots of families who are dealing with people who are difficult to house, struggling with substance use disorder or chronic mental illness or severe mental illness or other issues, and who have worked for years and years trying to find the supports that they need in our state and not been able to. And that's also how their family members land there. And so, yes, those services are not kicking in. They should have kicked in usually long before a person in that setting experienced homelessness. And they're just, the maneuvering through the systems when you have those kind of challenges is near impossible. I am very well versed in and able to maneuver through systems, and still maneuvering through systems through economic services, through other areas is both uncomfortable, shaming, hard to keep up with, lots of paperwork. Like it is not a really simple thing to do to get access to those services. And if the family doesn't economically qualify for those services, then and they can't find them elsewhere, or they don't have private insurance to qualify for if it's mental health services, then they don't have anywhere to go either. And so I think that there's gaps in wraparound supports that also put us in this place. But we know that housing is the first step to actual health, whether it's mental health, whether it's recovery, whether it's physical health. So we know that we need to keep people housed regardless of how they ended up there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Brenda. We have just 5 minutes before the end of this first section. So I want to make sure before we leave listeners, is there any kind of strings that we've started to pull that we want to make sure we kind of tie up before we head to break?
I think Emily talked a little bit about I was at Joint Fiscal too, but Emily talked a little bit about what was talked about at Joint Fiscal, what they found some money.
Yeah, so the administration made this announcement a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of shock because originally we really developed the plan for the housing and the housing wraparound services, the emergency housing money, the short-term, medium-term rental money, with this absolute explicit intention that it would last into March, so that when we got back into the legislative session in January, we would have time to figure out what the next step was.
Mhm,
It was like a very explicit, actual,
Very explicit.
proactive plan. And
Oops.
absolutely understand that the money went out the door faster than anticipated. And, you know, the need was perhaps greater than anticipated. And that makes sense. And motels maybe cost more than anticipated because of price gouging, all kinds of things. And we did not have the time to figure out what's next. In sort of negotiations around all of that since the announcement and at joint fiscal, and the legislature has no power to appropriate money outside of the legislative session. So, and the administration doesn't really also have absolute power to move stuff from one line item to another either. There's like some fuzzy lines there that involve a lot of well-intentioned negotiation. And so more money was sort of found in other buckets that could be moved around. The way that some of the emergency housing was funded can get sort of moved into a new bucket. There's the federal funding has all these strings attached. So more money was found in order to do the ramp down more slowly. That will really take us, I think from my perspective, except for one very strong caveat, fairly well into the legislative session where we can come up with a more proactive solution. And so I was glad for that. It's really, but that sort of positive collaborative negotiation and the need for that in order to find the money and move it where it is really precludes the Joint Fiscal Committee's ability to say like, what is going on here? How did you make this huge mistake and who is responsible? And so like that, like, you know, government accountability, legislative, like what you see sort of in Congress with joint hearings and like, you know, people throwing down the whatever, what is that expression? Gauntlet, thank you. Like that's not possible if we also want the administration to find the money and solve this problem with us. And so that's like one of the most frustrating things for me in the last year about like the position the legislature I'm in, what I want to get done and how I want to meet Vermonters' needs. So we weren't able to do that, but we were able to find money. The money that was not found, that I feel very, all the feelings about, and I'm sure people whose lives this actually impacts feel way more feelings than I do, is the fact that as of November 1st, folks who become homeless are not-
October 1st.
What?
October 1st.
October 1st. Folks who
Which is right around the corner.
Right around the corner. Folks who become homeless are not eligible for the like full motel housing that we've been providing through the pandemic. They are just going into regular GA rules at that point.
And the regular GA rules have not been ramped up the way that they need to be. And I would add that I am able to do a little bit of that and will and have been using my platform right now to do it, because the reality is that this is a huge mistake that never should have happened. It should have been done a different way. And the legislature has to figure out a way to with the administration. So they're really stuck in this place. But we also have to speak out and say, like, there's something wrong and there needs to be accountability. That's on everybody from reporters to actually report that there's a huge mistake, and people and people like myself who are challenging difficult to challenge incumbent governor and saying, like, how the hell does your administration make a mistake like this? And you are responsible for fixing it.
Thank you. We are out of time for this first half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, but stay tuned. We will be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and if you are just joining us, I'm speaking with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, as well as gubernatorial candidate Brenda Siegel. Welcome back, both of you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Just a reminder to listeners, you can find this show on WVEW, as well as a huge thank you to BCTV for all the work they do, sharing our YouTube videos with the rest of the state, as well as Emily's YouTube channel, our Facebook page, and wherever you find your podcasts. Emily, what do we need to remind listeners of?
Well, Olga, the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, and not the station, nor the platform, nor their employers, nor friends, nor family, nor pets, just the folks on the show. And I don't think you need to mention my YouTube station. No one goes to it. It's just like a wait.
It's just where we hold the videos so
I think you
BCTV
can
can find them.
adding that to the list. It's like there's like 2 people who subscribe. I don't push it anywhere. It's just like a file storage system at this point.
Okay. Now I just have to learn new muscle memory.
Sorry. And I don't know if the whole world needed to know that particular thing. I'm throwing it in there. This is how the radio sausage is made, folks.
Yes.
And I
yes.
make very complicated and data-driven decisions on our metrics for this show.
We do. We do. Brenda, before the break, you were talking about accountability. Mm-hmm. And I think that resonates with me right now because a couple of weeks ago when John Walters was on the show, who is the force behind the Vermont Political Observer blog, he and Emily and I got into a conversation about accountability and how can you actually do that in government when, quite often the legislature spends as much time out of session, which changes their legal parameters. And so for you, how do you plan on holding, or no, I'm going to ask that a different way. What would accountability look like for you around this issue?
Well, I I think it is complicated because they're actually in session less time than they are out of session. And unless you've advocated in the legislature or you've spent a lot of time there or you've served in the legislature, it's really easy to quickly be frustrated with things that aren't done or with the way that the sausage is made, unless you actually know it. And once you know it, there's a lot that you understand about the way that the connections when are made between the legislature and the administration. And one of the problems that I see with the current administration is that they don't collaboratively work with the legislature. And that is a really big problem, specifically the governor. And that's problematic because that means that in between time when a governor could be collaboratively working with leadership, coming up with some solutions that maybe can be done in that off time, that's a real opportunity. And instead of just making unilateral decisions about things that impact people's lives and that really sometimes undo the really hard work, like in this case of the legislature, because they have a clear intention and that can be undone when in the off session. And I've seen that happen. I don't think that's a common thing for that to happen with all governors, but with this governor, that happens frequently. And so it's a big problem. And it really highlights how difficult it is for the legislature to move forward on issues that we all care about, not just housing, around the overdose crisis, around climate change. The legislature's really stuck not being able to move forward, not only because of vetoes, but also because of the way that their work gets thwarted in the time between the legislative sessions. And so one way that I think there is accountability has to be a clear commitment to from the administration, from the governor, to work collaboratively with the legislature. Yes, they are different legs of government, but at the same time, they have to work together, especially when we have a part-time legislature. And then another piece is really—
before you go to another piece, can we talk about that piece?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and I just want to be like explicit about that. So like, if a law is passed, whether the governor signs it or not, it becomes law, right? And when the law is passed, that is the will of the people. It's not the will of the legislature. It is considered the will of the people and is the administration. That's why it's called the administration's responsibility to administer that law. And the administration regularly just doesn't administer laws that are passed by the legislature because they don't like it. But that's actually not like, that's not how it's supposed to work. And we don't have the structural capacity in the state to do anything about it.
Right. Right. And it's not been, at least my understanding is that's not been a huge problem necessarily with other, excuse me, with other governors. This is really a very unique, to somewhat unique anyways, problem with this governor, is that he is like, no, if I don't want to do it, I'm not going to do it. And that's not his job. That's not how it works. And then the second piece I was going to say is that the press, I don't think does the best job of holding him accountable either. You hear in his press conferences things that are very clearly problematic, and we don't really dig deep into them. And I wouldn't blame reporters. There's editorial decisions around the way that things are reported. And so I want to be really clear about that. We have some incredible reporters actually in our state that are very curious about some of these things, but do have to follow what they work at a place, and they have to follow what their editors want to see as well. So that's really important piece of what needs to be done in accountability. But the most important one is having a governor that works with the legislature and that is committed to carrying out the laws that the legislature passes. I would not anticipate as governor being 100% in love with everything that passes, although I was thinking the other day about if there's anything that's actually made it across the finish line that I didn't like by the time it got to the finish. I was talking about this at an event. And the reality is that there's a lot of robust discussion during the legislative session, but I don't think there's anything that's actually crossed the finish line, at least in the last few years, that actually got to the governor's desk that was something that I wouldn't have agreed with by the time it got there.
Oh, there certainly is for me. So I'm really impressed there isn't for you, but we don't need to get into like my favorite bill list. We were actually planning on doing a show with John Walters about that in the spring, and we never.
I'm not, and there's probably ones I'm missing.
Yes, you might have just like, yes.
Yeah. But like the ones that I've really not liked, like the ones that I've been like, this is a terrible bill, I don't like it, those ones have not made it to that point. And so would there be a bill that got to my desk as governor that I was like, I'm not really into this? Probably. But would I veto it? Probably not. And if I was going to, the legislature would have known in advance that this is a non-starter, that there's something that we need to do some work around it before. And that's part of the problem, is that with all of these bills, including around housing, that the legislature kind of has to guess the governor's position and whether or not he'll sign the bill, because he's not really saying, like, he says, I'll wait and see until it gets to my desk. And that robs Vermonters of progress, because if he was coming to the table, we would all get to see the positive impact of the work that is being done.
Well, I like that point, Brenda, because I think one of the frustrations I sit with the number of vetoes that Governor Scott has put forward, but also I think vetoes in general, we don't have a lot of time in Vermont to get work done in the legislative session. It's fairly short. There's a lot to do. And it feels like a lot of wasted effort if the legislature goes through all this work to create a bill and it's just going to die at the governor's desk. It's like, could we have put that time to something else or making a better bill? Or so for me, it just feels like wasted time as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, if he said, I'm absolutely never going to sign this bill, period. Having done a lot of advocacy with the legislature, I think they probably would, in many cases, not all, would be working on something else that he would sign, because they have a real commitment to getting things across the finish line and getting them signed. So sometimes to my frustration, that's sometimes where my frustration really goes. That's the reality of our legislature, is that they want to move things forward. Sometimes I want to, if he's going to be obstructionist, I wanted people to see that. But that's accountability to me, is for us to really clearly point out what's going on here.
Thank you. I want to shift back to housing again, if you guys don't mind. We talked in the first half about, the really deep need to shore up a lot of our crisis housing programs and making sure people have the supports and the wraparound services they need. But what I find interesting about Vermont as a whole when it comes to housing is we have a lot of issues with housing across a broad income spectrum. And especially right now with the pandemic and a lot of rents going really high and a lot of housing prices going very high, people who have traditionally been thought of as like middle income, who, maybe can't afford the best housing, but they're not worried about being homeless, suddenly are finding themselves in a much more precarious place between prices and what's available on the market and that type of thing. I would love to hear your thoughts, Brenda or Emily. What conversations are happening around kind of that whole life cycle of housing barriers that we can have in the state?
Well, go ahead. Well, first I'd say I think there's this particularly American phenomenon that is rampant in Vermont for the idea that everyone wants to consider themselves middle income, and in fact aren't. I think there are a lot of people who consider themselves middle income who are definitely, owning class or wealthy, and there's a lot of people who consider themselves middle income who are working class and really would qualify for capital A affordable housing, not just lower A affordable housing. I absolutely understand sort of the cultural constructs that keep folks from wanting to be in something that's like considered government subsidized or a program or anything like that. But I think we have less people who are actually middle income Vermont than we think we have. That said, we also don't have a lot of housing for middle income folks. And some of the conversations that are happening around the state to do something about that is that we know we have a lot of folks aging in place in fairly large homes that they don't necessarily want to live in because there's like a lot of shoveling and precarious walkways and all of, I think about my dad coming to live with me and like how he would never be able to walk out my door because of how uneven the ground is between my house and the driveway, right? So there's like that kind of stuff that's all over Vermont. And there are conversations about what it would look like to create middle income housing that is for older Vermonters who want to age in place, that is sort of communal but independent. And so there are conversations around that, a lot around downtown infill. And we passed and was vetoed a set of legislation to really incentivize that downtown infill. And you know a lot about that in your work life too, Olga, which I feel like I'm going to do a little disclaimer on the show, which I don't know if we've done before. Olga works for a housing development partner now.
Oh, yes, I have done that disclaimer before, but it's been a while.
I feel like it's relevant to the show, so I just want to like name that.
Yeah.
Not that you were keeping it a secret. I just like all of a sudden I thought of it, so I thought I'd say it. And so there's that infill work that's happening. There's a lot of work around a lot of towns, and this is not true in Brattleboro, but this is true in most towns in Vermont. It's only not true in Brattleboro because Brattleboro sort of been doing the work a little bit longer because we've had an explicit housing crisis a little bit longer, where zoning really prevents duplexes even, or like a farmhouse being converted into 3 apartments, that kind of stuff where even just using existing properties can't be subdivided, or where land couldn't be developed into more housing. And so that zoning that prevents denser housing development, that I think was originally, on some level we could say was originally passed to keep farmland intact, but I think it's probably more likely it was originally passed to keep sort of, a vision of white middle class Vermontiness intact.
Hey, listeners, oh, there she is. She's back.
Oh,
we heard originally passed to keep farmland intact.
Oh, was probably like also there's like a lot of whiteness and middle class norms around that. Like you don't want too many people living together. So doing a lot around zoning for density, doing a lot around downtown infill. Even Brattleboro, so many places where buildings slightly higher, where vacant lots could be developed, that kind of thing. And so that's a lot of what we're talking about for missing middle. But what we're not talking about, and I want to talk about, is the enormous number of homes that sit vacant in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And also, on that front, I want to just say before I move on, actually, that a lot of times when you say build up at all, and that people hear skyrise, and nobody is, I mean, people have said, so you want to build skyrises in Burlington and Brattleboro? And I'm like, no. I grew up here.
I want like a second floor on a building at the bottom of High Street that like has a dance studio and a gallery in it. Like just the other day, I was like, why is that building only 1 story? It could be 3 stories. It would actually make more sense in its environment because the buildings on both sides of it have more stories.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Mm-hmm. And with housing that people can afford in it too, because sometimes that type of housing gets built up and doesn't have that. And so one of the things that a couple things for affordable housing, there are places that have made every new build has had 25% of it be low income housing, and some qualify for people who are transitioning from homelessness. That has actually made huge dents in the experience of homelessness and people's mobility around states and around countries in other areas. And so it's something that I think we could look at. And then also cooperative housing is something that's really some of what Emily was talking about, duplexes, triplexes, even like multi-unit apartment buildings where people can actually co-op and own the building or own their unit. That's a way to address middle and even low moderate home ownership. And then in addition, we also need to talk about those places that are sitting vacant, including short-term rentals. I've been asked over and over again, should short-term rentals be regulated? And the answer is yes. If there is if you're renting in your own house, an in-law apartment or a room in your own house, that's different for a short-term rental. But if I'm in Newfane and people are buying where I live and people are buying up whole apartment buildings and that's the only few apartment buildings, then that's unacceptable in terms of our long-term rental crisis if we don't have some regulation around it, if it isn't at least bringing revenue in where we can make up some of that, some of those gaps in housing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Brenda. There was a term on your website that I actually wasn't familiar with. So I'd love if you would, at least for my own education, would explain to me. I saw the phrase, I think it was address zoning. Or was that meaning?
It was address zoning. I'm wondering if there was a spelling error, but I think it was address zoning, which is what Emily was just talking about. These zoning issues in general. I have to go back and look if I have a spelling error on my website.
Could have been having a dyslexic moment too. That does happen.
But what Emily was talking about, it's not that we are so supportive in our state of our local control of a lot of things. And some of that is great. And because we do have different needs in different areas, and we shouldn't ever be in a place where we're able to say, like, yes, we need more housing, but not in my backyard. That should not be something that we are doing in this state, because what it does is leave our neighbors, our community members, our children to experience homelessness, including folks who never thought that they would in their lives, who really, who had a severe injury at work or had, really, and it allows us to grow a stigma around struggle that I think is not healthy and not true about people who are struggling. And we do a lot better when we have mixed income housing, that when people are really able to have those kind of experiences where they are, around folks who generally people have stigma about, and learn that those stigmas are our biases. They're not reality. And it's a lot, I watched when we were sleeping on the State House steps, I watched Josh be asked multiple times if he had a meth problem, actually. And like 3 sentences, they asked how he became homeless. He would start to talk, and 3 sentences in, someone would ask if he had a meth problem or a drug problem, or
Interesting.
so offensively, they felt really onerous saying it. And I felt really defensive, watching somebody be treated that way and knowing him. But that's not uncommon. We walk by people who are struggling. We never even ask anything about their lives. And so this idea of mixed income, this idea of cooperative housing, all of these help also, and changing our zoning rules around to not really allow that type of NIMBYism, help us to build stronger communities overall, because those biases are not healthy for our communities either.
And that doesn't mean that anyone wants to turn like all the farmland into tract housing. Like that is not at all. Like, first of all, we do not actually have the wastewater infrastructure to be doing that in the first place.
Right, or the population at this point.
It really is. It's about downtown infill. It's about places where it is possible, where there already is development, adding further development. It's about like that affordable housing needs to be mixed so that everyone can see themselves in it and everyone can feel comfortable in it. It's about cooperative housing so that folks aren't in that position that I described, where they feel like I don't qualify, I'm not interested in a capital A affordable housing because it means the government's going to be in my business, right? It's about making sure that Mountain Home, which is a cooperative mobile housing park, has the resources that it needs and the policies that it needs for the residents there to thrive in their independence. There are so many options available, and we can mix them all together in Vermont to make it work.
Thank you. We have just 5 minutes left, and so I want to turn to Emily's very favorite question that I've been asking all the candidates, and that's, Brenda, if there was one policy that you feel could make Vermont work better for everyone, doesn't have to be housing, just one policy, what would you like to see enacted?
That's just so tough for me, because I think in such an intersectional way, and I just don't know how one thing would change everything. So I'll go this way. I would like to see us look at all legislation with sort of a test of who does this harm and who does it help, and make sure that we're not harming. Sometimes I think more marginalized people end up harmed with legislation because it's the best that we could do. And I'd love to make us look at that and have a real will to say we're not going to put legislation through that has that outcome. Even if it's the best we can do, we're going to find solutions for that, because it's same with the housing. I think that really puts us in a place where we can end some of that stigma around, and that bias that we have, implicit bias that we have around people who are marginalized, if we really intentionally change the way we look at policies. And I think in the governor's office, what you can do is make sure the people who get to lead in these administrations both have the experience, but also there's a lived experience aspect. And we have a bench of people of diversity. We have a bench of LGBTQ folks. We have a bench of Black and brown folks. We have a bench of women. We have a bench of all these folks that and BIPOC, Indigenous folks, that can be part of an administration that can make change. And so one thing that I'd like to see change is intentionally diversifying the leadership and the administration and the way we look at legislation overall.
Brenda, thank you. Anything else you want to leave listeners with before we wrap up?
If you'd like to learn more about me, you can go to my website at brendaforvermont.com. We are at the end of a long run for governor, and we need help with letters to the editor, contributions, and also if folks can write on their front porch forum, because it's time for us to have change in Vermont, and I'm excited to bring you all with me.
Thank you, Brenda Siegel, gubernatorial candidate. And Emily, where can people find more information if they want to be in contact with you?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org, where you'll find links to my social media accounts, my email address, phone number, etc. I have not updated the website as recently as I should, because I've been busy doing other things like this great show. But that is a great way to get in touch with me and see what else is going on.
Wonderful. And as always, you can find the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, as well as our Facebook page, our Captivate page. And you can always drop us a line at the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com. Have a great weekend, everyone.